My sister stood at the plaintiff's table, weeping as she faced the judge. Your Honor, my sister suffers from a severe mental illness. She has lost all civil capacity. My mother, sitting in the gallery, wiped tears from her eyes and nodded vigorously. The judge was paging through the case file. Then she looked up, her gaze traveling past the gavel and settling squarely on me. Ms. Shin Muen, would you like this court to disclose your true identity right here and now? My sister on the plaintiff's side froze. My mother, seated among the spectators, forgot she was in the middle of a performance. The color drained from both of their faces in an instant. The fluorescent lights in the courtroom blazed a sterile, piercing white, slicing at every face like a scalpel. I sat at the defendant's table in an unmarked black blazer, my hair pulled back in a low ponytail, my expression as still as stagnant water. My attorney, Lu Zhanting, was in his early 40s, wore gold-rimmed glasses, and was the priciest commercial litigator in the city. The lawyer my sister Shin Manning had hired stood across the aisle, sweat beading on his forehead, the complaint in his hand already creased from his grip. The judge's name was Zhao, a gray-haired woman with sharp eyes behind her reading glasses, eyes that missed nothing. Her words hung in the courtroom silence for several long seconds, like a stone dropped into a deep well, the splash never reaching the surface. Your Honor, my lawyer said, rising unhurriedly and adjusting his jacket, before I answer that question, I request the court's permission to submit supplementary evidence. Judge Zhao pushed her glasses up and nodded. Lu Zhanting pulled a manila envelope from his briefcase. He walked to the center of the courtroom and, one by one, laid the documents on the long table before the judge. His movements were deliberately slow, the sound of each page hitting the wood crisp and audible. These are the complete records of Ms. Shin Muen's angel investments over the past 5 years, he said, his voice level but every syllable distinct. Through Curtin Capital, a firm she wholly owns, she made early-stage investments in 32 domestic technology companies. The total capital deployed was 470 million yuan. Of those companies, 4 have since gone public, and 1 is currently in its IPO pipeline. Curtin Capital's paper return exceeds 400%. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Shin Manning whipped her head toward me, her lips trembling, her eyes brimming with something I recognized instantly: fear. I had seen that fear too many times, ever since we were children, every time I did something beyond her comprehension. When I was 7 and scored first in my grade, she stole my report card, ripped it to pieces, and flushed them down the toilet. She wore that exact same expression when she got caught. My mother, Zhou Xiaolan, gripped the armrest of the gallery bench so hard her knuckles looked like bleached bone. She opened her mouth, maybe to say something, but all that came out was a choked, muffled sob. Additionally, Lu Zhanting continued, pulling a neatly bound document from the envelope. This is a copy of Ms. Shin Muen's doctoral diploma. California Institute of Technology, Computational Neuroscience. Her dissertation committee passed her unanimously. She completed the program, from admission to graduation, in 3 years and 2 months. He adjusted his glasses and turned, his eyes moving past the defendant's table, past the plaintiff's table, past the ashen faces in the gallery, and finally resting on the national emblem above the judge's bench. Not only does my client have no mental illness whatsoever, she is a scientist and investor with an intellect far above the norm. The plaintiff, Shin Manning, and her mother, Zhou Xiaolan, attempted to use falsified medical records and perjured testimony to illegally seize a trust fund worth $3.2 million that belongs to my client. This conduct already constitutes malicious prosecution and fraud. My client reserves the right to pursue criminal charges. Those words sliced through the courtroom's taut atmosphere cleanly, like a blade. A sharp gasp came from the gallery. It was Zhou Xiaolan. She clutched her chest and began sliding off her chair like a candle collapsing in on itself. Shin Manning didn't move to help her. She just stood there, a statue struck by lightning, every expression frozen on her face. Only her eyes kept darting frantically from me, to the judge, to her own lawyer, searching for some crack she could slip through. Her attorney came to his senses faster than she did. The middle-aged man, whose surname was Wu, snapped his folder shut and addressed the judge in a voice that was practically fawning. Your Honor, my client may have been operating under a misapprehension of the facts. We request a temporary recess. Denied. Judge Zhao took off her glasses and enunciated each word. This court will not only continue, it will examine the authenticity of this new evidence right here and now. She turned her attention to me, and something in that stern, veteran jurist's gaze softened by a degree. Ms. Shin Muin, your attorney has submitted preliminary proof of your identity. The court now asks you, do you consent to having your full identity disclosed in open court? I rose to my feet. The wooden rail of the defendant's table pressed against my waist, cool and unyielding. I consent. My voice wasn't loud, but in the dead-quiet courtroom each word landed with the clarity of a chisel. My true identity is this: founder of Curtin Capital, PhD in computational neuroscience from Caltech, and current chief scientist of Origin Technologies. The moment those last three words left my mouth, Shin Manning on the plaintiff's side reeled backward, as if her spine had been ripped out. She stumbled into her water glass. It shattered on the floor, water fanning out across the white tile and spreading into a dark stain. She knew exactly what Origin Technologies meant. Everyone in that courtroom did. Origin Technologies was the unicorn in the domestic AI chip space, valued at over 20 billion yuan. And its chief scientist, the person the industry called the chip goddess, had never once appeared in public. That person was now standing at the defendant's table, looking at her own sister with an utterly blank face. Impossible, Shin Manning's voice pitched into something almost shrill. How could you be? You're that idiot who couldn't even string a sentence together. You've always been. You didn't even take the college entrance exam. You. Shin Manning. I cut her off, my tone as calm as if I were reporting data in a lab. The sister you claim never took the college entrance exam was accepted into an MIT early admission program her junior year of high school. Mother didn't tell you because she was afraid it would crush your ego. Another knife. Every stroke drew blood. Zhou Xiaolan finally managed to haul herself upright on the bench. Her face was a ghastly gray, the face of a corpse. She stared at me, her lips quivering, and forced out a few words. Xiao Wan, how could you? How could I what? I turned to face her, the corner of my mouth curving without warmth. How could I tell the truth? Mom, weren't you crying just now? Weren't you nodding along? Weren't you backing up Big Sister's little performance? Can't squeeze out any more tears. Zhou Xiaolan's face twitched, and fresh tears spilled down. But this time I couldn't tell if they were tears of regret or the tears of someone whose mask had been ripped off. Probably both, but I'd lost interest in distinguishing them. Judge Zhao banged her gavel, and the courtroom quieted. She paged through the documents Lu Zhangting had submitted, and when she reached the last page, one eyebrow lifted. The trust deed on file shows, she said, looking up and fixing her eyes directly on Shin Manning, that this trust was established by Ms. Shin Yuan at the age of 18, using her personal research prize money as the original capital. The beneficiary listed is Zhou Xiaolan. She paused, removed her glasses, and rubbed the bridge of her nose. In other words, the $3.2 million the plaintiff, Shin Manning, claims were misappropriated is actually a trust fund her younger sister created with her own money, naming their mother as the beneficiary. And the plaintiff attempted to gain indirect control of this fund by having her sister declared mentally incapacitated. This court has only one observation on that. She put her glasses back on, and her voice sank. What an appalling display of greed. Someone in the gallery couldn't suppress a laugh. It was a short, stifled sound, but in the hush of the courtroom it was jarring. Shin Manning's face went from ashen to iron gray, then to something perilously close to collapse. She wheeled on me, her expression twisting into a snarl I had never seen before. Shin Muin. You. Plaintiff, control yourself. Judge Zhao rapped her gavel again, her voice as cold as winter iron. Lu Zhangting rose at the perfect moment. Your Honor, in light of the plaintiff's clearly fabricated medical records and the blatant perjury committed in this courtroom by both the plaintiff and her mother, I move on behalf of my client for the following. First, that all of the plaintiff's claims be dismissed with prejudice. Second, that the plaintiff, Shin Manning, be countersued for malicious prosecution. And third, that Zhou Xiaolan be held criminally liable for perjury. With each point, Shin Manning's body jerked. By the third, Zhou Xiaolan in the gallery finally crumbled. Her body went limp, and she slid from the chair to the floor. "Mom!" Shin Manning shrieked, rushing over. Bailiffs moved in quickly. Someone called for paramedics, others restored order. The courtroom dissolved into chaos. And I stayed where I was, watching it all. Watching the woman who once grabbed me by the hair and slammed my head against a wall now lying on cold tile, eyes shut, lips blue-tinged. Watching the sister who once locked me in a basement for 2 whole days because I'd misplaced one of her lipsticks now kneeling beside our mother, her makeup ruined by tears. I should have felt vindication. But, strangely, I felt nothing. Just cold. A cold that seeped out from deep in the marrow, having nothing to do with the courtroom heating. The prelude to this farce had begun 3 months earlier. It was dusk in the old Eastern District when an unforecasted rainstorm cut loose. I was driving through streets flooded with runoff, and when I stopped at a red light, my phone rang. It was Zhou Xiaolan. "Xiaowan, you should come home tomorrow. Your sister has something important to discuss with you." Her voice on the line carried that artificial gentleness, like a pill wrapped in sugar, cloying, but unable to mask the bitterness underneath. "What's it about?" My eyes tracked the arc of the windshield wipers. "You'll find out when you get here. I can't explain over the phone." I hung up and tapped my fingers on the steering wheel. For 20 years, every time Zhou Xiaolan used that tone with me, it meant trouble. But I still had to go back, because that house still held the things my father had left behind. There weren't many. An old Shanghai brand wristwatch, a few yellowed notebooks, and a faded family photo, probably the only piece of proof in the world that I had once been accepted, even briefly, by this family. The next morning, I drove to the old Shin family house in the northern part of town. It was a 3-story building from the 90s, its exterior white tiles now stained and dark with age. The osmanthus tree in the yard, though, had grown luxuriantly, its canopy shading most of the courtyard. I pulled up outside and, before I'd even turned off the engine, saw Shin Manning's brand new white Porsche Cayenne, arrogantly parked dead center in the yard. She'd bought it last year, supposedly for nearly $200,000. On a claimed monthly salary of $1,200. The moment I walked into the living room, I sensed something wrong. Shin Manning sat in the middle of the sofa, legs crossed, holding a cup of black tea. She wore an off-white Chanel jacket and a Cartier watch on her wrist, exuding the air of a rich man's wife from head to toe. Zhou Xiaolan sat next to her, clutching a tissue, her eyes red as if she'd just been crying. Opposite them sat 2 strangers. A middle-aged man in a cheap suit, his hair slicked back, a stack of papers spread in front of him. And a young woman with glasses hugging a laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard like a stenographer on standby. "You're here," Shin Manning said, setting down her teacup and sweeping her eyes over me from a height. "Sit." I didn't sit. "What's this about?" "Get to it." Shin Manning and Zhou Xiaolan exchanged a look. Then Zhou Xiaolan's tears started flowing again. She bowed her head, daubed at her eyes, her shoulders shaking in a performance worthy of an award. "Xiaowan," Shin Manning sighed, putting on an expression of heavy-hearted concern, "Mom hasn't been sleeping well." "Do you know why?" "She's worried about you." "Worried about what?" "Your illness." Shin Manning stood and walked up to me, scanning me head to toe like a doctor examining a patient. "You've been different from other kids since you were little. You didn't like to talk, didn't like to be around people, shut yourself in your room messing with all that weird stuff. You know perfectly well how many doctors Mom took you to see." I was silent for 2 beats, then gave a small laugh. So, Shin Manning shot a look at the man in the cheap suit. He jumped up, all too eager, and handed me a document. The cover bore a few bold, blackened characters, "Application for Adjudication of Civil Competency." Clipped beneath it was a pre-filled petition for guardianship appointment. "The guardian designated?" "Shin Manning." "What's the meaning of this?" I flipped a couple of pages, then looked up at Shin Manning with an expression that hadn't shifted a millimeter. "It's for your own good." Her tone turned so tender it made my skin crawl. Your mental state is getting more and more unstable. As your family, we can't just stand by and watch you destroy yourself. If you sign this, Big Sister will take care of everything for you. Your money, your house, your investments, you won't have to worry about any of that. Just focus on getting better. When she said the word money, a light flickered in her eyes. It was there and gone in an instant, but I caught it with perfect clarity. I closed the document and placed it gently on the coffee table. And if I don't sign? Shin Manning's smile didn't waver, but her eyes went cold. Shawan, don't make your sister do something she doesn't want to do. Like what? She drew a deep breath and suddenly donned a wounded expression, her eyes even turning red. We might have to go through legal channels to protect you. Do you realize that if a court declares you to have diminished civil capacity, all your assets get transferred to the guardian's control? Then you'd still have to listen to me. So why not just sign now and we can all save face? I stared at her for 5 seconds. On the 5th second, her gaze flickered. It was the signal of a guilty conscience, but she was so sure she held a winning hand she never even thought to hide it. Got it. I stood, brushing non-existent dust from my clothes. See you in court. As I turned toward the door, Shin Manning's voice chased after me, cold enough to have been squeezed through clenched teeth. Shin Muin, who do you think you're fooling? You've been a freak since you were a kid. You never even went to college. What gives you the right to all that money? That money should have been mine. Isn't that right, Mom? Jo Xiaolan didn't answer, but I could hear her sobbing turn into strangled gasps. I didn't look back. I opened the door and walked out. The November wind bit through my collar the instant I stepped outside. I looked up at the sky. A gray-white ceiling of clouds hung low, like a filthy rag ready to be wrung out. Behind me, inside that house, my own sister and my own mother were plotting how to label me mentally ill so they could legally take everything I owned. That was my family. Back home, I opened my laptop and pulled up a file I'd sealed 3 years ago. An encrypted folder appeared on the screen. I typed a 16-character password and hit enter. Inside lay dozens of documents, photos, and recordings, arranged by timeline with meticulous precision. There were bank records from the first time Shin Manning tried to siphon money out of my account and got blocked. Evidence of her hiring someone to forge medical diagnostic reports. Security footage from last month when she tried to use my property deed as collateral at a bank and was denied. Every piece was crystal clear. Every piece was enough to make sure she couldn't stay on her feet in court. I'd started gathering all of this 3 years ago, the first time she set her sights on my trust fund. Back then, I'd simply thought it was a necessary precaution, like carrying an umbrella. It might not rain, but you'd better have one ready. Now it was raining. A downpour. I dialed Lu Zhongting's number. Mr. Liu, it's me. That case, we can start it. There was a 2-second silence on the other end, and then his voice came back tinged with suppressed excitement. You're finally ready to move? I'm not the one making the move, I said, leaning back in my chair and tapping the desk with my fingertips. She's the one who handed me the knife. 3 days later, the court summons was delivered to the Shin family house. Jo Xiaolan called while I was in the lab going over the latest chip tape-out data. My phone vibrated 7 times. I picked up on the 8th. Shawan, how could you? Jo Xiaolan's voice was sharp as fingernails on a chalkboard. Your sister was doing this for your own good. How could you drag her to court? Have you lost your mind? I held the phone away from my ear until she stopped screaming, then brought it back. Mom, she sued me first. Because you're sick. You've always been sick. You don't know how many doctors I took you to. Then tell me, I said, my voice soft as a feather landing on water. What exactly is this illness I've had since I was a child? The line went quiet. Quiet except for the static hiss of the line and Jo Xiaolan's rapid, ragged breathing. Go on, I said. What's the diagnosis on the paperwork? Schizophrenia. Jo Xiaolan's voice was trembling. Which hospital made this diagnosis? The Municipal Mental Health Center. Which doctor? I can't remember exactly. Mom. I cut her off, still completely calm. Your voice shakes when you lie. It's been that way my whole life. Total silence on the other end. I'll see you in court, I said, and hung up. When I set the phone down on the table, I noticed my fingers were trembling slightly. Not from anger, not from grief. Something more complex. Something that had been suppressed for 20 years was finally rattling its cage, ready to break free. Growing up, I was the family freak. Shin Manning was the Shin family pride, pretty, bubbly, sweet-talking, adored. She was the teacher's pet, the princess of her class, the perfect child all the relatives gossiped about. When she tested into a second-tier college, Zhou Xiaolan threw a 10-table banquet, practically wanting to announce it to the whole city. And me? I liked staying in my room by myself, taking alarm clocks apart into a pile of components and putting them back together, often with a few extra screws left over. In 4th grade, I built my own radio receiver from scratch that could pull in Russian broadcasts on shortwave. When Zhou Xiaolan found it, she smashed it and called me possessed. In middle school, the school organized an IQ test. After my score was entered into the system, the principal personally called Zhou Xiaolan and asked her to come to the school. She came home with a dark expression. I overheard her on the phone with Shin Manning. Those tests are all fake. Your sister is just a weirdo. Don't let it get to you. My junior year of high school, the early admission letter from MIT arrived at the house. Zhou Xiaolan tore it in half right in front of me and threw it in the trash. Her explanation, you can't even take care of yourself. Go abroad? You want to shame the Shin family? My father was the only one who ever spoke up for me. But that winter, he died in an accident. 3 days after he was gone, Zhou Xiaolan gathered every single thing he'd left behind into a cardboard box and shoved it into a corner of the attic. I snuck up there and looked. Along with the watch and the notebooks, there was a letter he'd never gotten to mail. The envelope had my name on it, but inside, the letter paper held only one line. Xiao Wan, you're stronger than all of them. Fly away. Don't look back. I folded that letter and slipped it into my school uniform pocket. I was 16. Later, Zhou Xiaolan had me withdrawn from school, citing poor health. She didn't tell me. I found out when I went to pack up my desk and the academic advisor looked at me with regret and said, "What a waste." I didn't cry. I didn't throw a fit. I just accepted it calmly, because on the day my father died, I'd already understood a truth. This family had never had a place for me. It never had, and it never would. Shin Manning was the lead, Zhou Xiaolan the director, and I was just the ugly side character written into their script to make the star shine brighter. But I never accepted being just a side character. From that day on, I prepared. Self-studied for the SAT, secretly applied to universities abroad, used the money from pawning my father's old watch to pay the first application fee. It took me 2 years to make up everything I needed, and on my 18th birthday, I dragged a beat-up suitcase that was 5 years old onto a flight to Los Angeles. Zhou Xiaolan and Shin Manning didn't realize I was gone until 3 days later. They thought I'd run away and even filed a missing person report. When the police pulled up my departure records and Caltech's admission confirmation, I was told Shin Manning's face stayed black for a week. At Caltech, I lived like an ascetic. I shuttled between the lab and the library, averaging less than 4 hours of sleep a night. My advisor, Professor Hoffman, said I was the most maniacal student he'd ever had. He meant it as the highest praise. After my doctorate, Professor Hoffman and I co-founded the first fund for Curtin Capital, focusing on early-stage tech companies with genuine core technology. The very first company we invested in was called Origin Technologies. Back then, it was just a 3-person team holed up in a garage, running a second-hand server they'd picked up at a flea market, working on AI chips nobody believed in. 5 years later, Origin Technologies had become the highest-valued chip company in the country, and I'd returned to this land as its chief scientist. People in the industry called me the chip goddess. The investment world called me the shadow hunter behind the curtain. But here, in this city where I grew up, inside that house with the yellowed white tiles, I was still that freak with a screw loose. That fact was confirmed for me one final time, in the rawest way possible, during the last mediation session before trial. The mediation room was small. A square table, 4 chairs, a framed print of the character 4 Harmony on the wall. Lu Zhenting sat on my left. Across from us were Shin Manning and her lawyer, Old Wu. The mediator was a man in his 50s, slightly overweight, balding, with a thick local accent. He flipped back and forth through the claims from both sides, his frown deepening. "This case, to put it plainly, is a family dispute," the mediator said, setting down the paperwork and rubbing his hands together. "Miss Shin Manning, your sister says you fabricated medical records. What do you have to say about that?" Shin Manning lifted her chin and fixed the mediator with a grievously wounded look. "I didn't fabricate anything. My sister really is sick. My mother can testify." "Sick with what?" "Schizophrenia." Shin Manning said it with absolute conviction. "She's had it since she was a kid. My mom took her to lots of doctors. We still have her medical files at home. Can you produce those files?" "Yes." Shin Manning opened her bag, pulled out a manila envelope, and slapped it on the table. "All here. Diagnostic records from when she was 15 up to now. Unbroken." The mediator took the envelope, pulled out the pages, and started leafing through them. After a few pages, his frown twisted into a full grimace. He looked up at me, then back down at the documents. Lu Zhongting sat with his hands folded on the table, a faint, knowing smile at the corner of his mouth. He'd known me for 3 years, and he knew I never walked into a fight unprepared. "Miss Shin Manning," the mediator finally said, putting the stack of records down, his voice turning stern, "are you certain these medical records are authentic?" Of course." Shin Manning's eyes flickered. "Then let me ask you this. This record here, dated March of last year, says, 'Patient presents with severe auditory hallucinations and paranoid delusions. Inpatient treatment recommended.' Yet to my knowledge, Ms. Shin Muin was in Beijing last March, attending the National Strategic Planning Conference on the chip industry. CCTV's national news even had a profile shot of her. Could a mental patient suffering from severe auditory hallucinations and paranoid delusions take part in a national strategic conference?" The air in the mediation room solidified. Shin Manning's face flushed crimson. Her mouth opened and closed, like a fish thrown onto a riverbank, its gills working frantically, but sucking in no oxygen. Her lawyer, Old Wu, reacted faster. "Mr. Mediator, medical records document a patient's subjective complaints. They don't necessarily need to correlate perfectly with real-world behavior." "Attorney Wu," Lu Zhongting interjected, his voice unhurried, as smooth as fine jade, "are you suggesting that a medical file claiming my client has severe hallucinations does not need to correspond to my client's actual behavior?" Old Wu's mouth snapped shut. "And furthermore," Lu Zhongting continued, pulling a document from his briefcase and sliding it to the center of the table, "this is a psychiatric evaluation report commissioned by my client from an independent medical institution. The conclusion: Ms. Shin Muin is in perfectly sound mental health, with an IQ score of 147, far above the population mean." The entire evaluation process was notarized, with complete video records. Shin Manning stared at that report, and every last drop of color drained from her face, faster than a Sichuan opera mask change. How do you have?" Her voice was shaking. "The medical records you forged," I said. My voice was very soft, but each word landed like an ice cube hitting glass. "The handwriting and the format, they do resemble real records. But you made 2 mistakes." Shin Manning's eyes went round. "First, I held up one finger. The hospital you used, the Municipal Mental Health Center, switched to a new record format 5 years ago. The format you used is the older, obsolete version. Second, the doctor whose signature you forged is named Lu. Dr. Lu retired 3 years ago." I lowered my finger and leaned back in my chair, the corner of my mouth tilting upward. "The last patient he saw before he retired was me, for an independent psychiatric evaluation, which I paid him to conduct." Shin Manning's face cracked open. Not in some melodramatic way, but in a quieter, more genuine disintegration. You could see it in her eyes. Some pillar that had been holding up her entire sense of reality was crumbling, like a building taken down by controlled demolition, the collapse starting from the lowest floor and racing upward. The mediator sighed and tossed the forged records onto the table. "Miss Shin, I strongly advise you to drop the suit." "On what grounds?" Shin Manning shot to her feet, her chair screeching half a meter backward. You've all been fooled by her. She's been a con artist since she was little. She pretends to be dumb. She plays the victim. She's tricked everyone. She hasn't tricked anyone. The mediator rose too, his voice not loud but unyielding. You're the ones who've been doing the tricking. Including your mother. The mediator added, each word nailing itself into Shin Manning's ears. Your mother's written statement says Shin Yuan once threatened you with a knife when she was 15. But the notary office pulled your school attendance records from that year. You had perfect attendance, not a single absence. Your gym class even has a photo of you running the 800-meter fitness test. Shin Manning swayed and grabbed the edge of the table. How can that be? Her lips trembled. Mom clearly said. What your mom said was a lie. Lu Zhongding stood, picking up his briefcase. Miss Shin Manning, you've been used by your own mother. Do you still not understand that? That line hit harder than all the previous evidence combined. Shin Manning whipped her head toward Lu Zhongding, her eyes nearly deranged, a churn of confusion, fury, and betrayal. It was as if he'd spoken a curse she couldn't possibly accept. You're lying. My mother would never. She's been helping me the whole time. She helped you because she thought you could win. Lu Zhongding opened the door and, without looking back, threw over his shoulder. What do you think she'll do when she realizes you can't? The mediation collapsed. As Lu Zhongding and I walked out of the room, Shin Manning's hysterical sobbing echoed down the hallway. Old Wu stood off to the side, helpless. Judging by his expression, he was already mentally calculating how to extract himself from this case. Was what you said true? I asked Lu Zhongding as we waited for the elevator. That Zhou Xiaolan was using her? Half and half. He pressed the elevator button, the light from the hallway glinting off his lenses. Some of the false information Zhou Xiaolan fed her really was fabricated. But your sister added plenty of her own. They're co-conspirators. Neither one is innocent. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped in, leaning against the cold metal wall. That was a nice touch, though, I said. The elevator began its descent, red numbers ticking down. Making her doubt her own mother. That works better than just crushing her outright. Lu Zhongding smiled behind his glasses. You taught me that. Strike the snake at its vital point. Shin Manning's vital point is her belief that she's Zhou Xiaolan's precious treasure. Once she starts suspecting her mother was just using her, half her foundation is already gone. The elevator doors parted, and the sunlight of the first-floor lobby flooded in. As I stepped out, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Zhou Xiaolan. 5 words, Xiaowan, Mom is begging you. I didn't reply. I put the phone back in my pocket and walked into the deep autumn sunlight. The next 2 weeks, all movement from the Shin side suddenly stopped. Shin Manning quit harassing me with calls. Zhou Xiaolan's texts dried up. Everything went unnaturally quiet. But the silence didn't make me relax. It made me more alert. Shin Manning wasn't the type to concede. Ever since we were kids, whatever she couldn't have, she'd find a way to get, and if she couldn't get it, she'd destroy it. When I was 18, a neighbor boy gave me a kitten. Shin Manning found out, and the next day the kitten was gone. I found it in the backyard. It was dead, a pink ribbon tied around its neck, a ribbon I'd seen in Shin Manning's hair. I never told anyone. I buried the cat quietly under the osmanthus tree and added another entry to the mental ledger I kept for Shin Manning. I was too young then to know how to collect. But I knew that one day every debt would be settled. That day was finally coming. 3 days before trial, I received an anonymous package. The box wasn't large. Inside were a stack of photographs and a letter. The photos were of Origin Technologies' office building, clearly taken from surveillance angles, some from the second floor of the coffee shop across the street, some from corners of the underground parking garage. A few were of the windows of my personal apartment, including my windowsill with the jasmine plant I'd just bought the week before. The letter was printed, no signature, just one line. Drop the lawsuit or you'll regret it. I spread the photos across my coffee table and looked at them one by one. I was on the last one when Gu Chengyuan walked out of the bedroom wearing nothing but a gray t-shirt, his hair still slightly messy. He came over, bent down to glance at the coffee table, and picked up the photo of my apartment window. He was silent for a moment. Should we call the police? He asked. Not yet. I gathered the photos and put them back in the box. Let's see what other tricks they have. Gu Qingyuan sat down beside me and took one of my hands. His palm was warm, his fingertips calloused from his rehab exercises. In the 3 years since I'd pulled him out of the hospital, he'd gone from being a vegetable abandoned by his entire family to someone who could walk on his own, feed himself, go to the grocery store like any ordinary person. Only I knew how much effort that had taken. And only he knew what I'd sacrificed to get him out of that hospital, to find him the best rehabilitation team, to hide him from the entire Gu family so he could recover in peace. Neither of us ever talked about the debt between us. But we both understood it clearly. We were two wounded animals cast out by our own families, who'd met each other inside fate's cage and then bitten through the bars together and escaped. On the day of the trial, I'm going with you, he said. Okay. The morning of the trial, I woke early. The sky hadn't fully lightened. Outside the window, the city was wrapped in a thin morning fog, scattered lights still glowing in distant office towers. I stood at the window and drank a glass of warm water, then opened my closet. Inside hung rows of clothes, from basic Uniqlo pieces to handmade bespoke suits. My fingers brushed across the fabrics and stopped on a black blazer with no visible branding. It was the jacket I'd worn at my Caltech graduation ceremony. 5 years old, and its cut was still razor-sharp. I got dressed, pulled back my hair, put on a matte red lipstick. The woman in the mirror had a quiet brow and a gaze like iron. Gu Qingyuan drove. He'd gotten his license back 2 months ago. The car cut through the morning rush hour, threading from one red light to the next. Outside, the city's mornings were always the same, scooters weaving through gaps, buses spewing exhaust, pedestrians on the sidewalk heading to the subway with blank faces. Nervous? Gu Qingyuan glanced at me at a stoplight. No. He was telling the truth. I really wasn't nervous. Someone who'd spent 3 years preparing doesn't get nervous when the show is finally about to start. It's like a leopard that's been crouched in the grass watching its prey for 3 hours. When the prey finally steps into range, the leopard's heartbeat is at its steadiest. The car stopped in front of the courthouse. I pushed the door open and climbed the steps in my heels. The staircase was long, maybe 40-some steps, a stretch of red carpet running up the middle, somewhat dirted by foot traffic. Boxwoods trimmed into spheres lined the flower beds on either side, a dark, waxy green in the early winter chill. The courtroom was on the 3rd floor. When I pushed open that heavy wooden door, Shin Manning was already seated at the plaintiff's table. She wore a pink Chanel suit, her hair in big waves, her makeup so polished she looked ready for a red carpet. Zhou Xiaolan sat in the first row of the gallery, clutching a handkerchief, eyes already red-rimmed. When Shin Manning saw me enter, her gaze swept over me and the corner of her mouth hooked into an icy smile. I knew that smile. I'd seen it my whole life, every time she thought she was about to win. Her lawyer, Old Wu, had upgraded to a more expensive suit and a tie. He looked significantly sharper than at the mediation. Apparently Shin Manning had given him a raise. Lu Zhongting settled beside me and slid a document in front of me. Final confirmation. The original funding sources for the trust, your personal asset inventory, plus the countersuit materials. It's all here. If there's no issue, we proceed as planned. I flipped through the file, then closed it. No issue. At exactly 9 o'clock, Judge Zhao entered the courtroom and the gavel fell. Court is now in session. The scene I described at the beginning unfolded right after the gavel struck. Shin Manning, through tears, laid out my condition, from bizarre behavior in childhood to paranoid delusions in adulthood, every detail vividly fabricated. She even threw in an anecdote about my sister chasing me around the yard with a knife, delivered with such emotional conviction her voice actually cracked. Zhou Xiaolan, in lockstep, dabbed her eyes, nodded, and let out stifled sobs at all the right moments. The mother-daughter duet was flawlessly choreographed. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have believed them myself. Then came Judge Zhao's question, Ms. Shin Muin, would you like this court to disclose your true identity right here and now? And then Shin Manning's and Zhou Xiaolan's faces, as if someone had painted them with whitewash. And then Lu Zhangting rising, pulling out piece after piece of evidence, shredding their carefully spun lies. And now, here we were. The courtroom was in chaos. Zhou Xiaolan was being loaded onto a stretcher by paramedics. Her eyes were shut, but beneath the lids, her eyeballs were darting around. I knew her too well. She was just using this to escape the situation. Ever since I could remember, any time she faced something she couldn't handle, she'd have an episode, headaches, palpitations, shortness of breath, and in severe cases, she'd just pass out. I'd watched this routine for over 20 years. I was long past being impressed. Shin Manning knelt beside the stretcher, weeping, her eyeliner running in black streaks down her face. The contrast with her pink Chanel suit was almost grotesque. Bailiffs were restoring order, and a few reporters in the gallery were snapping photos frantically, flashbulbs popping. This family dispute, with its in-court exposure of forged evidence and the jaw-dropping revelation of the defendant's identity, had turned into a media feast. Judge Zhao rapped her gavel again. Order. The courtroom gradually quieted. The paramedics carried Zhou Xiaolan out, and the bailiffs guided Shin Manning back to the plaintiff's table. She sat there, head bowed, shoulders shuddering, a flower broken by a storm. But I had no interest in savoring her misery. Plaintiff Shin Manning, Judge Zhao's voice regained its cool authority. This court will now ask you a few questions. You will answer truthfully. Shin Manning looked up dazed. These medical records you submitted, who gave them to you? Her lips trembled, and her eyes darted involuntarily to the now empty seat in the gallery where Zhou Xiaolan had been. My mother. Did your mother tell you these records were genuine? Yes. Were you aware that these records were forged? Shin Manning fell silent. Her fingers clawed at the edge of the table, knuckles white. Plaintiff, answer the question. I didn't know. Her voice was tiny as a mosquito. My mother said they were real. I believed her. Judge Zhao removed her glasses and fixed Shin Manning with a long, measuring stare. The look held no emotion at all. It was simply weighing. Weighing whether she was telling the truth or lying, whether she was the principal or an accessory, who in this drama was the scriptwriter, who was the director, and who was the puppet pushed out front to perform. The court rules as follows, Judge Zhao said, replacing her glasses and enunciating each word. All claims brought by the plaintiff, Shin Manning, are dismissed with prejudice. The plaintiff and her mother, Zhou Xiaolan, are suspected of fabricating evidence and malicious prosecution. Relevant materials will be transferred to the public security authorities for handling according to law. The defendant Shin Yuan's countersuit against the plaintiff for malicious prosecution is hereby accepted. A date for that trial will be set. She paused and shifted her gaze to me. Ms. Shin Yuan, as this case involves criminal evidence such as forged documents, this court requires your cooperation in providing all original materials for the relevant evidence. Can you comply? I can. I stood, my hands folded in front of me. I've been preparing for 3 years. I have backups of everything and can submit them at any time. Shin Manning's head snapped up, her eyes bloodshot as if ready to bleed. In that look were shock, rage, fear, hatred, and one last scrap of defiance. Even now, she refused to believe that the freak sister she'd bullied her entire life had, at her moment of greatest triumph, turned the tables on her. Shin Yuan. She suddenly spoke, her voice hoarse as if sandpapered. You think you've won? You think having money makes you somebody? You'll always be, always be. She choked. Because she realized she couldn't find a single angle of attack. Saying I was mentally ill? The evaluation report had slapped her down. Saying I had no education? The doctoral diploma had slapped her down. Saying I'd misappropriated assets? The trust documents had slapped her down. She stood there with her mouth open, an empty shell of a puppet after every string had been yanked out, all mechanisms useless. Always be what? I looked at her, my gaze placid. She didn't finish. The bailiff approached and indicated she should leave the plaintiff's table. She turned mechanically and, on those 10-centimeter heels, walked step by step toward the courtroom door. At the threshold, she stopped. Without turning around, she spoke in a voice so small it would have been inaudible if the courtroom hadn't been so silent. You were always Smarter than me, ever since we were kids. Why did you pretend to be like that? Her hand was on the door handle, shoulders trembling, voice trembling. I couldn't tell if there was remorse in it. I didn't pretend, I answered. I simply never exposed you. There's a fundamental difference. Shin Manning pulled the door open and walked out. The courtroom door swung shut behind her with a muffled boom. The reporters in the gallery began rushing out, some already drafting their stories with headlines like, "Sisters Battle in Court. A $3 million legacy unveils a staggering identity." I didn't care what they wrote. The things that truly mattered had never been in newspaper headlines. Lu Zhongting stood and began methodically returning documents to his briefcase. His movements were still unhurried, but the slight upward curve of his mouth said he was quite satisfied with the day's outcome. The countersuit trial should be calendared for next month, he said, zipping his briefcase. Zhou Xiaolan will have to appear. Her perjury charge isn't going away. Though, he pushed up his glasses and studied me with a measuring look. Are you sure you want to keep going? Once criminal prosecution starts, there's no turning back. Your sister and your mother could genuinely go to prison. I tucked my phone into my bag, stood, and smoothed the hem of my jacket. Mr. Liu, I said, do you know what they said to me 20 years ago, when they locked me in the basement? Lu Zhongting went still. They said, who's going to come looking for you? You don't have a single relative in this world. Then they turned off the light, locked the door, and left me alone in the dark for 2 days. I walked to the courtroom door and looked back at him. Back then, no one came to open the door for me. So tell me, why should I leave a window open for them now? When I stepped out of the courthouse, the sun was perfect. Early winter sunlight doesn't burn the way summer sun does. It lands on your skin as a thin layer of warmth, like someone patting you lightly through a layer of clothing. I stood on the top step and drew a deep breath. The air smelled of exhaust, of the bitter green of the boxwood leaves in the planters, of cooking oil drifting from the courthouse cafeteria. All of it mixed together, the smell of the human world. Gu Qingyuan was leaning against the car door waiting for me. When he saw me come out, he straightened and took a couple of steps toward me. The sunlight fell across his face, carving out the angles, his eyes a deep brown in that light, like a cup of strong tea. You won. I won. He didn't ask for details. He simply reached out, tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear, then opened the car door with a small gesture of invitation. The car merged into the afternoon traffic. Outside the window, the city gleamed under the sunlight, glass curtain walls reflecting the blue sky and white clouds. The sycamores along the street had shed a carpet of leaves, and sanitation workers were sweeping them into piles. What's your next move? Gu Qingyuan asked. Back to the lab first. I leaned into the seat. Next week there's a batch of new tape-out data coming in. Hoffman's been pressing for days. He was referring to Origin Technologies' next-generation AI training chip. If this chip taped out successfully, it would boost the domestic self-sufficiency rate for AI computing power from 40% to over 70%, a significance no less than the first atomic bomb. I'd poured 3 years of my life into its core architecture. And after that? After that, I turned my head to watch the streetscape pass by. After that, we wait for the countersuit trial. The news spread across the city while I was in the lab at Origin Technologies, glued to the imaging data from a scanning electron microscope. Xiao Tang, my PR person, sent me a flurry of links, every one of them about the trial. The financial press focused on Chip Goddess reveals her face to the public for the first time. The social news angle was Sisters Battle in Court. The legal blogs were analyzing key elements of malicious prosecution as a criminal offense. The comment sections were overwhelmingly in my favor. People called Shin Manning insatiably greedy and Zhou Xiaolan unfit to be a mother. Someone had dug up Shin Manning's social media photos flaunting her wealth, a Porsche, 3 Hermes bags, closets full of designer clothes, a devastatingly ironic contrast to the $1,200 monthly salary she'd claimed in court. Xiao Tang asked if I'd do an exclusive interview. I texted back one word, no. It wasn't that I was unwilling to face the media. There were simply more important things. The countersuit date had been set, 3 weeks from now, on a Wednesday, same courtroom, same judge. This time, Shin Manning and Zhou Xiaolan would be sitting at the defendant's table. And I had a lot to handle in those 3 weeks. The next morning, Shin Manning showed up at my door. I spotted her on the security monitor at the lab entrance. She was standing outside the building's access gate, wearing an ordinary gray down jacket, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail, no makeup on her face. If the camera resolution hadn't been high enough, I might not have recognized her as the woman in the Chanel suit who'd tried to lord it over the courtroom. She was holding a plastic bag with a few apples in it. They were very red, but on the grainy gray monitor, they looked cheap. I had security let her in. She walked into the lab while I was still making final corrections to a chip layout on my screen. The afternoon sun slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows, gilding everything on my workbench: the oscilloscope, the multimeter, the scattered design drawings, the jasmine plant I'd recently moved in. Sit. I didn't look up. She took the chair behind me. I heard the rustle of the plastic bag as she set the apples at the corner of my workbench. Xiaowan. Her voice was very low, with a studied softness, nothing like the voice that had called me a freak from on high in the old Shin house. I saved my work and turned around to face her. Up close, she looked even worse than I'd expected. The bags under her eyes were heavy, the lines from her nose to her mouth much deeper. Her lips were dry and peeling. Her fingers kept fidgeting with the zipper of her down jacket, pulling it up and down over and over. I came to apologize. She didn't meet my eyes when she said it. Her gaze was fixed on the jasmine plant on my bench. Everything that happened before. I was wrong. And Mom was misled by me. Can you just let her off? Let her off. I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands over my knee, and spoke as if asking what was for lunch. Drop the countersuit. Shin Manning finally raised her eyes to mine. They were already brimming with tears. If you just drop it, I'll do anything you want. I'll write a letter of apology. I'll publish an apology in the papers. I'll admit to every relative that I was wrong. Just please, don't let Mom go to prison. She's old. Her health is bad. She won't survive it. She sounded so sincere. The tears fell right on cue, precisely when she said the word Mom. I watched her cry for about half a minute. Then I opened a drawer in my desk, took out a document, and placed it on the desk in front of her. What's this? She wiped her tears and looked down. Statements for 3 credit cards in your name, I said. Plus your Porsche loan, plus your spending records at luxury malls. Over the past 12 months, you spent a total of, let me check, $473,000. Shin Manning's tears stopped. And your personal annual income is $14,400. I kept going, my tone as steady as if logging lab data. Of the money you spent, how much did your mother give you? How much did you quietly siphon out of the trust fund? And how much did you get from banks by forging my signature? Do you need me to read it out for you, line by line? Her face wasn't pale anymore, it was gray. The gray of someone whose lies have been stripped bare so thoroughly, they don't even have the energy to invent new ones. You're not here to apologize, Shin Manning. I stood up, slipping my hands into the pockets of my lab coat, looking down at her. You're here to probe. You want to know how many more cards I'm holding and where your escape route is. So let me tell you, you have no escape route with me. She stared up at me, lips quivering. It took her a long moment to force out a sentence. What do you actually want? What I want is simple. I turned and walked back to my workbench, picked up the jasmine plant, and gently nudged one of its leaves. I want both of you, in court, in front of everyone, to admit everything you've done to me. And I mean every single word. And then I set the plant back down and faced her. The law will do what the law does. Shin Manning rose slowly. She stared at me for a long time, and the emotions in her eyes peeled away layer by layer, first pleading, then anger, then despair, and finally something I'd never seen on her face before. Resignation. She turned and walked to the lab door. Her hand was already on the handle when she stopped. She didn't turn around. Xiaowan, she said, do you remember that time when you were little, in the rain, and the neighbor's dog was chasing you? I grabbed a broom and drove it off. I remembered. I was 7. A sudden downpour that evening. Old Lou's black German shepherd next door had slipped its chain and chased me for 2 blocks. Shin Manning was just coming home from school, saw it, grabbed a broom from the side of the road, and charged, screaming and swinging, until the dog ran off. That night, she gave me her bed and slept on the floor herself. "I remember," I said. "Then can you?" "No," I cut her off. She stood still for a second. Then she pulled open the door and walked out. The door shut behind her. Her footsteps faded down the hallway and eventually vanished into the sound of the elevator. I stayed where I was until the lab was completely silent, then slowly sank back into my chair. The sun outside had shifted, slanting onto the workbench and dyeing those red apples the color of amber. At 7 years old, Shin Manning would grab a broom and face down a German shepherd to protect her little sister. At 31, she would drag that same sister into court, call her a mental patient, and try to steal $3.2 million. 24 years stretched between those two versions of her. More than enough time to turn a person into someone else. More than enough time to let a bond that should have been close rot into a cesspool I couldn't bear to look at. But I was no longer the little girl crouching in the muck, waiting for her big sister to pull her out. I'd spent 18 years climbing out and another 3 building my defenses on solid ground. Now I stood on dry land, watching the hands reaching up from the swamp, and I was never putting my own hand out again. Never. The next 2 weeks passed in almost unnatural calm. Shin Manning didn't contact me again. Zhou Xiaolan, after being discharged from the hospital, reportedly went straight back to the old Shin house and shut herself in. Lu Zheting was pressing forward on the countersuit preparations. Xiaotang's series of reports kept rolling out. Public sentiment online only grew hotter. Someone had even photoshopped my face onto Origin Technologies' chip products, the caption reading, "Mentally ill? I build chips." I saw Shin Manning one last time, the day before the countersuit trial. That evening, I went back to the old Shin house. Not to reconcile. To retrieve something. The cardboard box my father had left was still locked in the attic. Inside, along with the watch and the notebooks, was that letter, the one with a single line written on it. I'd kept it in my school uniform pocket when I was 16, but when I left the country, I'd forgotten to take it. All these years it had been lying in that old box in the attic, keeping company with dust and cobwebs. It was nearly dark when I pushed open the gate to the courtyard. The osmanthus tree was bare, dead leaves piled thick on the ground. It looked like no one had swept in a long time. A single dim lamp burned in the living room, casting a blurry patch of light through the window into the dark yard. Zhou Xiaolan was sitting in the old rattan chair in the living room, wrapped in a worn blanket. She visibly stiffened when she saw me walk in. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I didn't speak either. I crossed the living room, climbed the wooden ladder to the attic, and pulled open the dust-caked door. The attic looked exactly as it had 18 years ago, piled with old furniture, broken boxes, and forgotten memories. The cardboard box was still in the corner, a broken sewing machine sitting on top of it. I moved the sewing machine and lifted the lid. The watch was there. The notebooks were there. And at the very bottom, the letter was there. The envelope had yellowed, its edges riddled with tiny holes from insects, but the 4 characters on the front, Shen Yuan, recipient, were still legible. I took the letter out. I didn't open it right away, I tucked it into my pocket first. Then I climbed back down and passed through the living room. Zhou Xiaolan was still in that rattan chair, but she was no longer rigid. Her head hung low, and her shoulders trembled faintly. I stopped walking. "Mom," I said. The word tasted like cold iron on my tongue. It had probably been over 10 years since I'd called her mom to her face. All our communication for years had been through texts and calls, cold words and electric currents, no warmth. Zhou Xiaolan's head snapped up, a flicker of surprised gratitude in her eyes. But it was extinguished the instant I spoke my next sentence. I got the letter. My hand was in my pocket, my fingers tracing the edges of the envelope. The one Dad wrote me 16 years ago. It has just one line on it. "Xiaowan, you're stronger than all of them. Fly away. Don't look back." Zhou Xiaolan's face spasmed, and tears welled in her eyes. "Why didn't you mail it back then?" She opened her mouth and managed a few broken syllables, but they never formed a complete sentence. "Forget it. It doesn't matter anymore. I turned toward the door. I'll see you in court tomorrow. Xiaowan, her voice chased after me, thick with tears. Mom did so many things wrong. Mom is sorry, but can you just forgive? No. My hand was already on the door handle. The cold metal pressed against my palm like a dose of clarity. I'll see you in court tomorrow, I repeated and pulled the door open, stepping into the night. The weeping behind me was muffled by the door, reduced to a dull, choked whimper. It was a song I'd been hearing for over 20 years. I knew its melody by heart, and it stirred nothing in me anymore. I took a deep breath. The early winter night air was sharp and clean, my nostrils filled with the smell of cold. Above me, the stars were shockingly bright, scattered like diamond chips across black velvet, every one distinct. I pulled out my phone and dialed Lu Zhanting. Mr. Lu, tomorrow morning at 9. Courthouse. Got it. You ready with your final statement? Ready. I hung up, looked up at the stars one more time, then carefully took the yellowed envelope from my pocket and opened it. The paper was so brittle the fold lines were nearly torn through. The pen ink had faded, but every character was still painfully clear. Xiaowan, you're stronger than all of them. Fly away. Don't look back. And below it, another line. When I'd first read this letter at 16, that line hadn't been there. It appeared when I saw the letter again at 18, the ink fainter, a different color, as if added later. If they ever force you to come back, it's time to collect the debt. When my father died, everyone said it was an accident. I wasn't so sure anymore. I refolded the letter, put it back in my pocket, and lifted my eyes to the glittering skyline in the distance. Somewhere out there, the lights of Origin Technologies burned all night, and my team was making the final sprint for the next chip's tape-out. In that place, no one called me a freak. No one said I was sick. No one tried to tear things out of my hands. In that place, I was just Shin Muin, a woman who had earned everything she had through intellect and sweat. Tomorrow, I would go back to that courtroom and make a final break with the past. On the morning of the countersuit trial, the sky was as gray and heavy as a sheet of lead. The courtroom was packed, nearly twice as many spectators as the first time. Along with the reporters who'd been there before, there were many unfamiliar faces, colleagues from Origin Technologies, investors from Curtin Capital, even a few people in dark green uniforms sitting in the back row, wearing insignia I didn't recognize. Later, I'd learned they were from national security. Origin Technologies' chips involved strategic state technology. The news that I, the chief scientist, had been dragged into a criminal case had alarmed the highest levels. Shin Manning sat at the defendant's table in a plain white blouse, her hair in an understated ponytail, no makeup. Compared to the polished look at the first trial, she seemed a different person. Zhou Xiaolan sat beside her, clutching that same crumpled handkerchief, head drooping, shrunk into herself. When Judge Zhao entered, every eye locked onto her. Her presence was even more solemn than before. She spent a full 3 minutes paging through the file in front of her before looking up. Defendants Shin Manning and Zhou Xiaolan, the plaintiff Shin Muin has countersued you for malicious prosecution. This court now asks both defendants, how do you plead? Shin Manning rose slowly. Your Honor, she said, her voice soft but distinct in the hush, I plead guilty. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Reporters' keyboards clattered. Flashbulbs popped again. Defendant Zhou Xiaolan, and you? Judge Zhao's eyes shifted to the older woman. Zhou Xiaolan stood on trembling legs, tears already streaming down her face. She opened her mouth, managed a garbled syllable, then her body sagged. But she didn't go down. She grabbed the rail of the defendant's table and, with everything she had, steadied herself. I plead guilty, she said. Judge Zhao nodded, made a notation, then turned to my side. Plaintiff Shin Muin, do you have anything to say? I rose. Every gaze in the courtroom converged on me, Shin Manning's, Zhou Xiaolan's, the judges, the reporters, the spectators. Probing, pitying, curious, scrutinizing. I looked at none of them. My eyes traveled past the entire courtroom and fixed on the national emblem hanging on the wall. Your Honor, I began, my voice even, I'd like to tell a story. Judge Zhao pushed up her glasses, said nothing, and gestured for me to continue. 20 years ago, there was a little girl, and she had an older sister by 5 years. The sister was very pretty, a sweet talker, and everyone loved her. The younger sister didn't like to talk. She liked to stay in her room and take things apart. Everyone thought she was strange. Their mother especially favored the older sister, regarding her as the family's pride and the younger sister as the family's disgrace. I paused. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the water moving in the heating pipes. When the younger sister was 15, she was accepted into an early admission program at MIT. That night, her mother tore the admission letter to pieces right in front of her and threw it in the trash. Her reason was, "You want to go out there and shame this family?" Someone in the gallery drew a sharp breath. When she was 16, the younger sister's father passed away. 3 days after he was gone, her mother gathered all of his belongings into a cardboard box and locked it in the attic. The younger sister snuck up there and found, in that box, a letter her father had left for her. It had only one line, "Fly away. Don't look back." When she was 18, the younger sister used money she'd earned online to buy a plane ticket to the United States. She dragged an old suitcase to California. In 3 years, she earned a doctorate. In 5 more years, she turned a garage startup into a unicorn valued at over 20 billion yuan. She thought if she just became exceptional enough, she'd never have to have anything to do with that family again. My voice quivered, just slightly, but I clamped down on it. Then her own sister and her own mother joined forces to take her to court. They called her mentally ill. They said she'd lost her civil capacity. They wanted to seize a trust fund in her name, worth $3.2 million. A trust fund she had established at 18 with her own research prize money, with the beneficiary listed as. I turned my head and looked at Zhou Xiaolan's bloodless face at the defendant's table. Her mother. A wave of suppressed noise swept the courtroom. "Your Honor," I said, returning my gaze forward, my voice restored to calm. "I don't need their apologies. I don't need their compensation. All I need is for the law to give me a just verdict. So that everyone knows, blood ties are not a pretext for blackmail. Family bonds are not a tool for extortion." I sat down. Beside me, Lu Zhanting tapped the table twice with his fingers, our signal meaning, "Well said." Judge Zhao was silent for a long moment. She removed her glasses, wiped them, put them back on, and banged her gavel. "Defendants Shin Manning and Zhou Xiaolan, this court grants you one final opportunity to speak. Do you have anything to say?" Shin Manning stood up. She turned not to face the judge, but to face me. Her makeup was wrecked, her eyes bloodshot. Her lips trembled for a long moment before she forced the words out. "Xiaowan, I'm sorry." She bent at the waist into a deep bow, so deep she stayed there so long I thought she might never straighten up. "Big sister owes you," she said, rising, tears streaming down her face. But the corner of her mouth curved into something, an ugly, weeping smile. "Big sister will pay." Zhou Xiaolan also struggled to her feet behind the defendant's table. She said nothing, only looked at me. The things in her gaze were too complicated. I couldn't read them, and I didn't want to. Judge Zhao sighed, then brought down her gavel. "The court now pronounces judgment." Everyone rose. Defendant Shin Manning is found guilty of malicious prosecution and is sentenced to 1 year in prison, suspended for 2 years. Defendant Zhou Xiaolan is found guilty of perjury and is sentenced to 8 months in prison, suspended for 1 year. Both defendants shall jointly bear all litigation costs of the plaintiff, and within 10 days of this judgment taking effect, shall publish a formal apology in a provincial level or higher media outlet. This judgment is final and takes effect upon pronouncement. The sound of the gavel echoed in the courtroom for a long time. I closed my eyes and heard the beat of my own heart once, twice, 3 times, slow and steady. Like a ritual finally reaching its end, like a heavy door swinging shut behind me. It was over. A debt more than 20 years in the making had been settled today. When I walked out of the courthouse, the seam of gray clouds overhead had split open. Sunlight poured through the gap like a golden sword plunged straight into the earth. Guqing Yuan stood waiting at the bottom of the steps, holding a cup of hot coffee. He'd bought it from the convenience store across from the courthouse, the green logo on the cup, steam rising into the cold air in white wisps. It's over. He handed me the coffee. It's over. I wrapped my hands around the cup, the warmth seeping into my palms. Home then? I was about to answer when my phone buzzed. The caller ID was an encrypted number. I recognized it. It belonged to the chairman's office at Origin Technologies, the room on the 38th floor that required triple-factor authentication just to enter. Dr. Shin, came the steady, measured voice on the other end. The people from National Security are here at the company. They'd like to speak with you about the next generation chip and your role in national strategic projects. I looked up. The golden rift in the clouds was widening across the skyline. Tell them, I said, taking a sip of coffee, the bitterness and warmth sliding down together. I'm on my way. I hung up and started walking toward the car. After a couple of steps, I stopped and looked back over my shoulder at the courthouse. Shin Manning and Zhou Xiaolan were hobbling out the main doors, supporting each other. They stood on the steps a moment, then shuffled off in the opposite direction. Their silhouettes grew smaller and smaller among the crowd and finally vanished around the corner of the intersection. My thumb pressed unconsciously against the edge of the letter in my coat pocket. The fragile texture of the paper reached my fingertip through the fabric, a signal only I could understand. Fly away. Don't look back. Dad, I did it. I turned around and walked into the wind toward Gu Qingyuan's car. The sunlight had fully broken through the clouds now, flooding the street and stretching every pedestrian's shadow long. The city was waking up under that early winter sun, traffic, crowds, everything churning along in orderly noise. And up on the 38th floor, in a conference room overlooking the whole city, a group of people was waiting for me. Waiting to push the country's most critical technology to the next level together. I opened the car door and got into the passenger seat. Let's go, I said. Gu Qingyuan started the engine and pulled into the rushing river of traffic. The car stereo was playing that old song again. I turned up the volume, leaned back in my seat, and let out the deepest, most complete exhale I'd managed in 3 years. 3 months later, Origin Technologies' next-generation AI training chip, Sangming 1, taped out successfully. Its performance tripled the leading international products, with half the power consumption. The day the news broke, the company's valuation shot past $50 billion, and my personal net worth soared alongside it. But I'd stopped paying much attention to those numbers. After the press conference, I walked out of the auditorium and encountered an unexpected person in the lobby. Shin Manning stood there, wearing a cream-colored coat, holding a bouquet. It was jasmine, the same variety as the plant I kept in the lab. Her face was bare of heavy makeup, her hair cut shorter, and her whole presence seemed quieter. Congratulations. She held out the flowers, her voice carrying a calm I'd never heard from her before. I took the bouquet and bent my head to smell it. The jasmine fragrance was light, barely there, like something ambiguous you couldn't quite name. Thanks. She hesitated a moment, as if choosing her words. I got a job. At a children's coding academy in the south part of town. I'm a teaching assistant. She paused, and the corner of her mouth lifted into a slightly self-deprecating smile. Monthly pay is $500. A couple zeros short of my old Porsche payment. 1 step at a time, I said. She raised her eyes to mine. There was a glimmer of light wavering there, but it didn't turn into tears. Xiaowan, she said, when I'm teaching those kids to write code, sometimes I think of you as a kid taking apart that alarm clock. You take the whole thing apart and still put it back together, and the leftover screws you'd turn into a little keychain that lit up. I didn't remember the keychain, but I remembered the girl who took apart alarm clocks. She sat on the dark basement steps, surrounded by gears and springs, a shaft of sunlight falling through a tiny vent high on the wall, landing a small patch of light in her palm. She pieced those screws together one by one and made a crooked, glowing keychain. That was the first thing she ever created. In all the years since, she'd created countless things: chips, algorithms, investment portfolios, a business empire. But nothing had ever made her prouder than that little keychain glowing in the dark, made in the darkest place from what others considered scrap. because that was the very first light she built. Big sister's going. Shin Manning stepped back, gave a small wave. You're busy. She turned and walked toward the exit, and as she stepped outside, the afternoon sun caught her just right, gilding the edges of her cream coat in pale gold. I stood there, holding the jasmine, and watched her walk away, one step at a time, until she disappeared into the flow of people outside. Gu Qingyuan had come up behind me without my noticing. He was completely done with rehab now, his stride steady, his posture relaxed. Your sister. He looked in the direction Shin Manning had gone. And then, I glanced down at the jasmine in my arms. She brought me flowers. Are you two reconciled? I thought about it, then shook my head. Not reconciled. Some things can't be reconciled. I switched the bouquet to my other hand. But people have to keep moving forward. She'll walk her path, I'll walk mine. And the flowers? The flowers, I bent my head and breathed in the jasmine again. The flowers are innocent. Gu Qingyuan laughed, tucked his hands in his pockets, and walked with me toward the parking garage. By the way, he said, about your father. National Security has an update. I stopped walking. 3 months ago, after I'd found my father's letter, Lu Zhenting had helped me reach out to contacts in national security to investigate the real cause of my father's death. The extra line on that letter, if they ever force you to come back, it's time to collect the debt, meant my father knew something before he died. What did they find? Back then, your father worked at that small factory the Shin family ran. On the surface, it made hardware fittings. In reality, Gu Qingyuan lowered his voice. It produced precision components for military projects. Your father was a key technical backbone. He had several critical parameter sets in his possession. The week before he died, someone tried to buy that data from him. Big money. Who? A company called Hontai Precision. The legal representative, a man named Zhou Rui. Zhou Rui. Zhou Xiaolan's distant nephew from her maiden family. My breath caught. So you're saying? I'm saying, Gu Qingyuan's eyes went dark, your father's death might not have been an accident. And your mother might know far more than she's ever let on. I stood at the exit of the parking garage, staring at the ceaseless traffic outside. The sun lay across the asphalt, a faint shimmer of heat rising from it. The office towers in the distance stood a grim gray in the afternoon light, a row of silent giants. I tightened my arms around the jasmine, feeling the stems press lightly against my forearm. Gu Qingyuan, I said. My voice was quiet, but it held steady. Call Lu Zhenting for me. What are you going to do? Tell him, I said, stepping out into the sunlight, the next fight is about to begin.